Before introducing today's guest speaker, I would like to make a couple announcements. First, Saturday, February 20, day after tomorrow at 12 noon, we have an open house. We will be giving information about our degree programs, as well as scholarship information, as well as taking a tour of our historical landmark buildings. So please feel free to join us and invite any friends, family, neighbors that you feel would be interested. Also, mark your calendars for March 1st. We have another lecture series titled Female Spiritual Leaders with Tahira Ahmed from Northwestern University. So please join us for that as well. Today's lecture focuses on a topic that is the foundation and cornerstone of Islam, which is the Quran. And we as Muslims believe that the Quran is the word of God and is beyond space and time, in that it is relevant to a 21st century American as it is to a 7th century Arab. And it is in this sense that we need to humble ourselves and recognize that we can never have a complete or perfect understanding of this scriptural text, the Quran. And it is in this sense that when we have somebody who does study and research on a particular subject and aspect of the Quran, that we give an open mind and an attentive ear. And with this, I would like to introduce today's guest speaker, who comes to us from the University of Chicago as a PhD candidate whose dissertation focuses on the historical content of the Quran's origins and the background of the Quran's thematic and lexical content within pre-Islamic Arabia. To this end, he conducted research on old South Arabian, ancient North Arabian, Nabatean, Sinaitic, Syriac, and Aramaic inscriptions from the Arabian Peninsula and neighboring areas. He has also worked on the process of the Quran's canonical development and reception during the Umayyad and Abbasid caliphates through the works of the classical Ulum al-Quran. His research interests include early Islamic history and historiography, Arabic paleography, Syriac Christianity, classical and late antique Greek texts, and biblical studies. Please give a warm welcome for Mr. Suleyman Dost.
Thank you, Ali, especially for suffering through all these weird Semitic languages and trying to pronounce them. I suffered myself too at the beginning with them, so I totally understand you. So welcome, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters. Thanks for coming, first of all. And I want to start by paying my gratitude to the people involved in this lecture series. In this place in the American Islamic College, and thanks to people especially for inviting me today. I spent 7 years in Chicago by now, and I personally witnessed American Islamic College growing from, well, literally nothing into this moment where it became a burgeoning school of Islamic studies. So. Especially under the leadership of Mr. Yurtsever, which is very exciting. I can tell you that American Islamic College ushered in a lot of enthusiasm and excitement about Islamic studies in Chicago and the greater Chicago area. And I hope that it will grow into a major center of Islamic learning, not only in this land of the free, but also in the whole world someday. So now, my talk today is a progress report, or a briefing, if I may call it that way, about the recent developments in the academic study of the Quran. Some major questions and issues in the field of Quranic studies, and some insights from my own research on the Quran. But before that, I feel a little compelled to present a series of disclaimers and clarification so that I can justify the title of my talk, Academic Study of the Quran in the West. I'm fully aware that the study of the Quran has been a major branch of traditional Islamic sciences, right? And the most pertinent of which is, of course, the tafsir tradition, the Muslim Quranic commentary tradition, which has been under the larger umbrella of the so-called Ulum al-Quran, the Quranic sciences, the traditional Quranic sciences. And some really extraordinarily illuminating works have been produced in this line. We can think of, for example, Ibn Jarir al-Tabari's tafsir, الجامع البيان, and also الزركشي's البرهان في علوم القرآن, and also Imam Jalaluddin al-Suyuti's الإتقان في علوم القرآن, which are extraordinary works in the traditional علوم القرآن genre. And this line of work is, of course, is very much alive in the Muslim tradition today, in the Muslim world today. But this today is not my concern. This line of research, I'm not going to talk about this. Although in the Q&A we can deal with this as well. And I will talk more about the field of Quranic studies as a growing field in Europe and in North America through the works of scholars who primarily wrote in German, French, and English. So today's talk about this scholarship. So hence the West in the title. And I'm sure that in the West a lot of people have very high opinions about the Quran, including people like Donald Trump and Bill O'Reilly, but this too is not my concern. I don't care about this too. I will deal with works produced by scholars working in university circles, in academic circles, and hence the academic study of the Quran, that part of my title. But I'm also aware that a lot of these frontiers that I'm trying to draw are very fuzzy in the humanities and social sciences. What is West? What is really academic? But I guess as I continue talking, you will try to get a sense of what I'm really talking about. So, and while I talk about the current status of the Quranic studies in the West, I will focus on three major areas of research. The first one is what I call the redaction history of the Quran, which more or less is concerned about the research about the composition of the Quran, the text as we have today, and its development, and also the so-called manuscript studies of the Quran. And the second line of research is the philological and linguistic research on the Quran, which is also a very exciting part of Quranic scholarship. There has been a lot of fireworks and debates, especially in this aspect of Quranic studies. And then the third one is what I a little ambitiously call the content of the Quran. And here I will deal mostly with the so-called biblical subtext of the Quran, the local history in the Quran, and the Arabian background of the Quran, which is actually my dissertation work. So let's begin with the first one, the redaction history of the Quran. Now, Muslim historical tradition has its own version of Quran's redaction, right? Which is almost entirely based on narrative material and has very little bearing on actual documentary evidence. So you may know this story, right? At the time of the Prophet, we are pretty sure from the Muslim sources that the Quran between two covers was not collected as we have today. It was done primarily at the time of the first Caliph Abu Bakr. And then a copy was made. At the time of Abu Bakr's death, it ended up with Umar. And when he died, it ended up with his daughter Hafsa. And then at the time of the third Caliph Uthman, when Muslims were all over the world, in places like Armenia, in Azerbaijan, when they were fighting, there was a lot of debates about how correctly people were reading their Quran and how correct their recitation was. So there was a growing concern at the time of the third Caliph Uthman to have a standard copy of the Quran to be sent to major centers of Muslim conquest. So we believe, again, based on the Muslim traditional material, that a lot of copies, 5, maybe 6, 7, the exact number is not known, these number of copies were sent to major cities like Fustat in Egypt, Kufa and Basra in Iraq, to Damascus. And these copies were meant to be the standard copies that everybody has to follow. This was done at the time of the third Caliph Uthman, right? This process of, if you want, fixing the Quran, making it a stable text, if you want, was met sometimes with agreement and sometimes with a lot of opposition. So the story is told that the famous companion of the Prophet, Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, who was in Kufa when the text of the Uthman, the copy that the Caliph Uthman prepared, when it arrived in Kufa, he was extremely mad. He said, I stayed with the Prophet for so many years and learned a lot of the chapters of the Quran from his very mouth, and now people are trying to sell me their copy of the Quran. He was extremely angry about this process of fixing the Quran. He showed a lot of opposition to this process, but at the end he said, okay, my copy can stay with you, but also you have to respect the Uthmanic Codex that was sent to the center. Another companion who had his own copy in Damascus, Ubay ibn Ka'b, was also against this motion of fixing the Quran. And today, based on a lot of Muslim sources, including Suyuti's Al-Itqan, we see that these copies, owned or held in the property of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Ubay ibn Ka'b, they were slightly different from what we have today. So one difference that is quoted in Muslim sources is the copy of Abdullah ibn Mas'ud didn't have the first chapter, Surah Al-Fatiha, and the last two chapters. And more interestingly, the copy of Ubay ibn Ka'b had two more chapters added to the Quran that we have today. And some of you, I'm sure, when you're reciting the Ad'iyat al-Qunut after the prayer of Witr, that's what we recite. In the Codex of Ubay ibn Ka'b, these two small prayers that we pray were actually chapters of the Quran. So these were the basic parameters of Quranic redaction history according to the Muslim tradition. According to the books like Kitab al-Masahif of Ibn Abi Dawood, Az-Zarkashi's Al-Burhan, or Suyuti's Al-Itqan. Then Muslim scholars also record that at the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the Umayyad governor of Iraq, he made a little, I wouldn't say changes, but mostly vowelization and pointing of the text. Because remember, the earliest Arabic writing was written in a defective script, right? No dots, no vowels, no indications of long letters. So at the time of Hajjaj, Muslim scholars note that he made some arrangements about the vowelization of the text. But we also know that people kept actually using companion codices belonging to Abdullah ibn Mas'ud, Ubay ibn Ka'b, and some variant readings based on the consonantal text. This consonantal text that was made fixed by Uthman ibn Affan, we call it Rasm. It was basically the consonantal picture of the Quran, and people continued to recite the Quran based on their own vowelings and dotting. They recited it differently. At the time of Ibn Mujahid, which is early 10th century, a long time after the Prophet, that these recitations were boiled down and restricted to 7 canonical readings. This was more or less the Muslim side of the story of Quran's completion. That's how now we have this book between two covers. But of course, there's very little material evidence to either accept this narrative and also to reject this evidence. We have very little evidence for this. And interestingly, none of the codices from the time of Uthman ibn Affan really came today. We don't have any extant copies of the Uthmanic corpus. Of course, there are two major aspirers to this, honor. There's one copy in Tashkent, the so-called Tashkent Codex, which is known traditional to be an Uthmanic codex, but work on this codex showed that it's actually not from that time. It's probably a little later. And another copy is the Topkapi Codex. And I know that AIC has a facsimile of this codex from Topkapi Palace, right? So these two copies are known traditionally to be from the time of Uthman ibn Affan, but especially the work on their orthography we're pretty sure that it's from the early Abbasid period, which is late 8th century, early 9th century. So then, even though these copies are not really from the time of Uthman, we know that the Quran was quoted, cited, mentioned in a lot of the earliest papyri we can find from the early Islamic period. That's one thing we know, that the Quran is from that period, of course. And then we also know that there really is no Uthmanic copy, but a lot of the copies of the Quran, the earliest ones we have, are very early. And especially when you consider that in the pre-modern world, a lot of literary works existed without their original copies. To give one example, a lot of the books written by Plato and Aristotle, their copies we have only from 10th, 11th, and 12th century, although they were written way back in the 5th century BCE, 6th century BCE, 4th century BCE. So it was very common for these things to be much later than they actually were written. And another issue is, of course, the Hebrew Bible. Does anybody have any guess from which time we have the earliest next to complete copy of the Hebrew Bible? Considering that it was written 8th century BCE.
900 BCE?
Yeah, it's 11th or 12th century. It's very late. So considering all these, the earliest copies of the Quran, which are from 8th century, 9th century, for a pre-modern text, this is pretty impressive. To have the copies of the Quran this early. I listed some of the earliest possible codices of the Quran. Medina 1A copy is actually also from the Topkapi Palace, but not the famous Uthmani Codex. We only have a few pages from this codex. And from Paris, we have the Bibliothèque Nationale copy, number 332, which is also a very early copy. We know that it's at least from early 8th century. And then there's another copy from Meknes, Morocco. We know that it's very early. And then in Germany, in Munich, there's this copy called Wittgenstein number 2, which is also a very early copy of the Quran. So, and the thing is, a lot of these copies are very conservative copies. And what do I mean by this is, they don't have a lot of variation from the text we have today. If you look at these 4 copies that I mentioned, they're almost exactly the same as we have today in terms of the consonantal text. That's why a lot of the times work on the earliest manuscripts of the Quran have been very dull and boring. You look at it, it's exactly the same thing. But this situation changed in early 1970s. And through a very major discovery. So in 1972, construction workers, they were repairing the old mosque of Sana'a. Sana'a is the capital of Yemen, and there was a great reparation project in the old mosque. And their workers found these sacks of Arabic writing, these fragments that were filled in sacks and used as filling for the dome of the old mosque. And they let the Yemeni Antiquities Department about this. People came in and looked. They said, this could be very crucial to the historical and archaeological inquiry. So the Antiquities Department asked West German experts about this, because only in West Germany at the time there were people who knew a lot about the Arabic orthography. So they invited this person called Het Puwen, who is a German scholar of Arabic orthography, and he came in and looked at them and suddenly realized these are, first of all, Quran copies. Secondly, they look quite different from the earliest extant copies that we have of the Quran today. So he started working on these copies in the 1980s, and later on in the 1990s, they were curated by a Swedish scholar. And early in the 2000s, UNESCO published a CD of these small fragments of the Quran, a complete codex from Sana'a. So what was the significance of these Sana'a manuscripts. For the first time, and this is very interesting, we realized that some of these manuscripts are palimpsests. A palimpsest is when you have a parchment, you write on the parchment, and back in the time this was something very expensive. You don't want to throw it in a garbage bin. You wash it, you wash whatever you had on the first page, and then you write again on it, whatever you want to write. And people realize that there is a superior script, which is what you see with your own eyes, but also there is a text that can only be seen through ultraviolet lighting. And they looked at these so-called inferior script, and they realized that there are interesting variants. So here, it's a little difficult, but you can see that there is some writing at the background, which is very pale, right? And when people actually use some special techniques to make sure that this appears, they have seen some interesting variations. So this is from Surah At-Tawbah, verse 73, and you can see the word for Jahannam in the Sana'a manuscript as a nar. So a lot of the variations we have from the Sana'a manuscripts were like this. It doesn't really change the meaning. Jahannam means hell, nar means fire. They've been used in the Quran interchangeably for so many times. So in terms of meaning, not a lot of things changed. But one interesting thing was that until then, a lot of the copies didn't have any variants at all. So this was probably one of the earliest discoveries of some development within the Quran from the pre-Uthmanic times to the Uthmanic Codex, right? Again, this has very little bearing on the meaning, but people argued that maybe the Yemen, the Sana'a Codex is a codex of a companion. Somebody had a copy from among the companions of the Prophet, and he took this copy to Yemen. It's not the standard Uthmanic Codex. This was his own personal copy. There might have been small changes in this copy, and considering 600 pages of pre-modern work, this much variation is completely okay, right? And right now, people are still working on the Sana'a manuscripts to see whether they can find other interesting variations that might give some hints about the development of the Quran as a text that is written down, but not a lot of, I would say, variations that would interest scholars came out. A lot of them are of this nature. Sometimes small omissions, sometimes small additions, but this is more or less the standard. And now, based on some radiocarbon dating that was done on these manuscripts, Sana'a manuscripts are considered to be the earliest copies that we have today of the Quran. Some of them can be as early as 650, which would be the time of Uthman, the third caliph. Which is very interesting because, as I said, all the other copies we have are either from early 8th century or possibly late 7th century. So this is more or less the situation in the redaction history of the Quran. The work on the Sana'a manuscripts are only recently being available, and this might change some of the ideas that we had about the Quran's development, but this is where we are in terms of the textual development of the Quran. Now I'm moving to the second major area of research, the philology and linguistics of the Quran. Now, for a lot of us, especially for the Muslims, this is a little weird as an area of research. We know that the Quran is Arabic, right? First of all, the Quran says that it's in Arabic. We have inter-Quranic evidence, if you want, that it's Arabic. On top of that, people read it as Arabic, right, for centuries, and they understood it. Scholars of Islam at the early period said that there are some obscure words that we cannot quite understand, which is okay. There are some words of foreign origins, but really nobody doubted that this was written in Arabic. And only recently there is some disagreement over this, and this is what I'm going to talk about now. For Muslim scholars, again, the text is in Arabic, and they brought evidence from pre-Islamic poetry saying that if we have some problems in understanding the Quran, here we have some examples from pre-Islamic poetry. We have some things that we can compare with and we can understand it, right? And they admitted that there are some, what I would say, interesting, obscure, unintelligible words that were not known maybe at the time of interpretation. So these scholars focused on these so-called loan words of the Quran, right? For example, if you look at the Suyuti's Al-Itqan, you will see the word sirat, right? Sirat al-Mustaqim, the straight path. He will say that this word is from Latin. In Latin, the word strata, which means a central road of a city, became the sirat in the Quran. This is just one example, right? They said that the word istabrak is coming from, for example, Middle Persian. They said that the word Hawari, the Christian apostle of Jesus Christ, is coming from Ethiopic. So even Muslim scholars were aware that there was this interesting phenomenon of loan words or foreign words in the Quran. And they also worked on the inflection of some personal names. And here I will talk about my own personal name. My name is Suleyman, right? And it's also mentioned in the Quran. This is the King Solomon of the Hebrew Bible, the Prophet Suleyman of the Quran. In the Hebrew Bible, the version is, the name is Shlomo. Shlomo means his peace, basically, in Hebrew. Muslim scholars wanted to know why from Shlomo we moved to Suleyman, if that's the original form of the word, right? And they said, oh, in Syriac, which is in between Hebrew and Arabic, the version is Shleimun. So at the end there's a nun, which kind of connects why today in Arabic we have the nun. So scholars worked on these different words and proper names to see what kind of things we can get from all these languages. Now, this is normal and okay because Arabic is a Semitic language. And it is from the same family as Akkadian, Aramaic, Hebrew, Syriac, Classical Ethiopic, Ugaritic. All these languages are from the same family, from the Semitic family of languages. And they are all based on trilateral roots, right? What I mean by this is if you know Arabic or any other Semitic language, you know that ideally at least, or theoretically, every word is can be conjugated from the single three-letter root. And this is the case for all Semitic languages, right? And a lot of these languages use the exact same words for the exact same root. For example, in all Semitic languages, almost across the board, qatala is to kill, right? In Syriac, Hebrew, Ethiopic, all of them have the same word for to kill. Wahaba is to give in all Semitic languages. So again, here too, there was a little deadlock about research because you figure out which words are of foreign origins, and that's it from the Quran. And all the rest looks completely understandable from Arabic if you look at it from Arabic. But people were sure that Syriac, especially Syriac, gave a lot of loan words to the Quran, and the consensus was that this was the language who provided the Quran with a lot of religious terminology. Especially after this Alphonse Mingana's Syriac influence on the style of the Quran, which was published in 1927. But something changed in the 1920s. Something fundamental happened, especially. First of all, the authenticity of pre-Islamic poetry was questioned for the first time, right? Pre-Islamic poetry is the bedrock of Quranic interpretation. Muslim scholars show examples of these poems to make sure that parts of the Quran can be understood based on these poems. In 1925, Taha Hussein, a famous Egyptian belletrist, who wrote a book called Fishir al-Jahili about pre-Islamic poetry. In that article, he argued that the pre-Islamic poetry is probably not pre-Islamic. He said this is probably, this represents the poetic understanding of later Abbasid period. Exactly the same year, a scholar from Oxford, David Margoliouth, wrote an article called The Sources of Arabic Poetry, he said the exact same thing. He had no idea that Taha Hussein was writing about this as well. So both of them said, these poems are a little fishy. And if you look at it, especially in Margoliouth's article, one of the most famous pre-Islamic poems, Lamiyat al-Arab, written by Ash-Shamfara, that has exact direct quotations from the Quran. So either, of course, Shamfara was before the Prophet, right? So there's something fishy about this. And these scholars argue that maybe, especially some specimens of pre-Islamic poetry may not be actually pre-Islamic. So what does this mean for the study of the Quran? First of all, this would mean that there is no precedent for the Quran, right? There is nothing written in Arabic before the Quran. It is foundational. It's the first prose text in Arabic. Not only that, but it's probably the earliest text that we have from Arabic. And more importantly, as I said, it's written in a defective script, right? Remember, here, the dots are completely irregular. You don't have any voweling. So a lot of letters, ba, nun, ta, tha, yeah, all of them would be the same thing. On top of that, no vowels. There's no way you can see whether something has a dhamma or a fatha or any other voweling. And no indication for the long letters. So this is pretty difficult to read. If you already don't know, if you didn't memorize the whole text, this is really difficult to read. So what this created an extremely interesting idea. Some scholars today argue that maybe the text of the Quran is not Arabic. Maybe this consonantal skeleton we have here, if we read this in Syriac, it makes more sense. This is the so-called hot topic of Quranic studies today, right? Some scholars, especially this guy from Germany, Christoph Luxemburg, argued that, I think, yeah, there he is. This is a Syriac text, which looks a little similar to Arabic if you look at it. Some people even argued that the Arabic alphabet was actually derived from this Syriac script. So this guy, Christoph Luxemburg, in 2000 wrote a book called Syro-Aramaic chez les arts des Coran, the Syro-Aramaic reading of the Quran, in which he argued that the Quran makes more sense, especially some passages make more sense if you read it in Syriac, which was a huge disappointment for a lot of people. It created a lot of tension, but a lot of potential for research at the same time. And even one aspect of his writing caught the attention of people at the New York Times. New York Times, I think it was in 2001, they published an article and said, maybe the virgins that are kind of promised to suicide bombers are not virgins, because in this book, Luxemburg argued that that passage in the Quran means they are basically just white grapes. So this made a lot of news, especially in the United States. This theory is, of course, really absurd, and on so many levels. Anybody who knows any other Semitic language, anybody who knows Arabic already, would tell you that this doesn't make a lot of sense. But one has to know Syriac, actually, to be able to judge how stupid this argument was. So Syriac is a language from the Semitic language family, and it existed especially in southern Turkey, which is today Harran and Ufa, and part of northern Syria and northern Iraq. And it never came more southern than probably some parts of Iraq. So there's no way the language of Syriac was used by anyone living in Western Arabia. And on top of that, this language has only 22 letters, 22 phonemes, whereas Arabic has, as you know, 28 different phonemes. So there's no way this language could express whatever we can express by the letters of Arabic. But this kind of scholarship somehow stuck with us because of the basic reason that there is no positive material evidence from the time of the Quran. And even today you can see that the Mecca and Medina of the time of Prophet is nothing like the Mecca and Medina of today. So there's no archaeological and historical evidence that we can assuredly say, okay, this is where the Quran came from. So in my own research, I took a position against this idea that the Quran makes more sense from other Semitic languages, right? And I wanted to look at some precedents of the language of the Quran and the context of the Quran to see whether I can find any parallels without looking at Muslim sources themselves. So my primary research is on these so-called Arabian inscriptions. This one is from Yemen. This is an old South Arabian inscription. As you can see, it has nothing to do with Arabic. It's not Arabic already. This is a different language. The script is completely different. But this language is actually very close to the original context of the Quran. And it can give you a lot of ideas about these words, these obscure words and obscure phrases in the Quran, and they can inform you about what their meanings could be. And especially the hapaxes of the Quran. The hapaxes of the Quran are the words that can only be found once in the Quran. And when there's only once in the Quran, it's sometimes difficult to guess what it actually means. And these languages really help to provide some examples for these single words as well. So instead of searching, if you want, the Holy Grail of the Quran's language in Syriac, we should probably understand the development of Arabic language better. And this has been recently the kind of scholarship that was done on the language of the Quran. But I have to say still that this recent undue emphasis on Syriac as the substratum of the Quran is really there. And it's waning, it's getting less and less interest, but it's still there, unfortunately. And one argument that is being debunked recently is the development of the Arabic script, right? You know that the Arabic script is a little unique. It is cursive. It has only 15, 16 symbols, so it needs vowels and dots to make sure that everybody understands what you're writing. So people argued that it's coming probably from Syriac, especially in the 20th century. They said that the origin of Arabic script is Syriac. But this is a Nabatean inscription from 328, which mentions a king called Imrul Qais. And this looks much closer to the Arabic script than the Syriac script. So we argue today that probably Nabatean was the source of Arabic script. So even this is changing recently. Syriac is being taken down from being the holy grail of the Quran. Now, this brings me to the third major area of research in the Quranic studies today, which is the content of the Quran. And when I say the content of the Quran, especially the biblical content of the Quran. So, this is no surprise that the Quran is a very biblically informed text, right? Anyone who read the Quran and read some Hebrew Bible and New Testament would tell that a lot of the figures, a lot of the narratives, a lot of the motives are very similar in the Quran and in the biblical tradition. For example, people like Adam, Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Joseph, Isaac, Moses, David, Solomon, Ezra, all of them are mentioned both in the Quran and the Bible. And this has always been for Western scholars to be a good point of entry to the Quran. They knew already these people, they knew already these figures from their own books, and they compared the Quranic versions of these stories with their biblical versions. And some of them even argue that the Quran is a biblical apocrypha, a version of the Bible, if you want, written in Arabic. And especially one scholar called Hartwig Hirschfeld, who was a very important German scholar of the Quran from early 20th century, he said that the Quran is a counterfeit of the Bible, but in a chaotic condition. Because anyone, again, who read the Bible would say that there is a narrative, there is a chronological development, but in the Quran, especially the codex that we have today, if you look at it, There is no chronological procession. There is no developed narrative. So it's very difficult for someone coming from the Bible to the Quran to make sense of what is going on. So this is all good and acceptable because, again, the Quran has a lot of biblical figures and narratives and motives mentioned in it. But there are a few very fundamental problems with this basic characterization, right? First of all, of course, there are some non-biblical figures in the Quran and non-biblical stories in the Quran, right? The so-called Arabian prophets, Prophet Hud, Salih, and Shu'aib, for example. And there are details about pre-Islamic Arabia in the Quran that neither the Hebrew Bible nor the New Testament can account for. That's the first problem, right? The second is, even the stories of the biblical figures have some different and varying versions from which we find in the canonical Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. So I have to give a few examples to make sure you can understand this. The story of the Prophet Abraham's conversion, right? He saw, if you want, he had an astrological contemplation. He looked at the sun, the moon, and the stars and said, none of these can be my God. These have to have one superior God, and this is how he became basically a monotheist, by searching himself. Now this story of Abraham's conversion and becoming an iconoclast, breaking the idols of his town in ancient Ur, is not mentioned in the Hebrew Bible. Not in the Genesis story of Abraham, not in any parts of the Hebrew Bible, not in the New Testament, right? But this story you can find in a book called the Book of Jubilees, which only exists in Ethiopic, classical Ethiopic, and another biblical midrash, which is called Midrash HaGadol, the Great Midrash, which is a text from Yemen. Another example for this is the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba, right? The famous story when Belqis, which is known from Muslim tradition, went to visit the Prophet Solomon, or the King Solomon, in Jerusalem. This story as well is found in the Quran, but not in the Hebrew Bible. Nowhere in the Hebrew Bible. The only version that is close to the Quranic version comes from a text called Targum Sheni, or the second Targum on Esther, which is a very late text, much later than the Hebrew Bible. And another very telling example is the mention of Jesus in the Quran. According to the canonical Gospels, canonical New Testament, we have very little evidence or information about Jesus as an infant, as a kid, right? But the Quran puts a lot of emphasis on this. And we know that some non-canonical Gospels that we have from 2nd century, 3rd century, and 1st century, like the Proto-Evangelium of James, or some infancy Gospels from Syria, have this version. And have very interesting stories about how Jesus was as a kid. Apparently he was a very troublesome kid. But these versions actually match with the Quran, right? But not with the Hebrew Bible and not with the New Testament. So this is why a direct, I would say, quotation from the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament into the Quran is very problematic. And third, there are some really significant omissions and interesting twists about stories of biblical figures and prophets in the Quran, right? Again, if you know any biblical history, there is no exilic or post-exilic biblical figure in the Quran. What do I mean by this? There's no Daniel in the Quran. There's no Isaiah. There's no Ezekiel. Although these are very major figures in the post-exilic story of the Hebrew Bible. Looking from the New Testament, there's no Paul in the Quran, right? Which is a very central, very important figure in the New Testament. And there are also some arguments of the Quran that do not make a lot of sense if you're coming to it from a Judeo-Christian perspective. The most important one, the very salient one, is when the Quran in Surah At-Tawbah says, the Jews say that Uzair is the son of God. Ask any Jew today, anyone who knows anything about the biblical tradition, they would tell you that nowhere, at no times, Jews believed that Ezra, which is the biblical counterpart of Uzair, believed that Ezra was son of God, right? So these are some of the issues where we cannot quite match the biblical tradition with the Quran. So now, today, the status of the scholarship is that we admit that the Quran has a very intricate relationship with the biblical tradition. Nowhere the Quran directly quotes, for example, neither the Hebrew Bible nor the New Testament, except on one single occasion. Does anybody know where the Quran directly quotes the Hebrew Bible, the Psalms? This is from chapter 21, verse 105, when the Quran says, "Innal arda yarithuha ibadiy as-salihin." This is almost direct quotation from Psalms 37:29. So the issue is very complex, and it's really impossible to find direct biblical or even parabiblical. When I say parabiblical, midrashic, Talmudic, etc., quotations in the Quran other than this one single example. So again, part of my research was actually about this very matter. What are we going to do with the historical material in the Quran? First of all, I've shown that many of the non-biblical stories of the Quran, the so-called Arabian stories of the Quran, can be attested or even followed through Arabian epigraphy. So I'll give a few examples from these. For example, the Quran talks about the destruction of Adam in Yemen, among the people of the Sabians. It mentions as Sayl al-Arim, right? And we have evidence from Sabaic inscriptions, which is part of Old South Arabian epigraphy, that actually there was a dam in Marib, in a city called Marib, which is very close to Sana'a today. And the destruction of this dam in Marib caused a lot of trouble for irrigation in Yemen, and this is why probably a lot of the Arab tribes moved from Yemen into Central Arabia. So this normally is a story that only Quran mentions, right? You can't find it in the Hebrew Bible, you can't find it in any other historical tradition, but we have evidence actually in Arabian epigraphy that this is something that actually happened. And another example I have is the mention of Prophet Salih, right, in the Quran. The Quran in the chapter Surah Al-Hijr mentions that people of Al-Hijr, to whom Prophet Salih was sent as a messenger, had these houses carved into the rock, remember? And we have evidence, especially from Nabatean inscriptions, that actually a city called Hagra, which is the Aramaic counterpart of Al-Hijr, existed. And today it is in northern Saudi Arabia, and it's called Madain Salih, so-called cities of Salih. And actually they have a lot of, not houses, we know, but at least sepulchres or graves that were carved into the rock. And I don't know if people can today visit Madain Salih, but if you visit Petra, which is today in Jordan, you can see some of these rock-carved tombs. So this again can be attested through Arabian epigraphy. And then the Quran mentions the so-called Christians of Najran, or in the Quran they're mentioned as Ashab al-Ukhdud, the people of the trench. We know that Christians of Najran before the rise of Islam were killed and persecuted by a Jewish king called Dhun Nuwas. This is what Muslim scholars tells us. This is how part of Surah Al-Buruj was, interpreted. And we have evidence today, again from South Arabian inscriptions that I worked on, that a king named Yusuf Athar, which is the Arabic version is Dhun Nuwas, invaded the city of Najran, destroyed all the churches that people had, and killed a lot of Christians. So this story as well although it's not attested anywhere else from the Quran, not in the Hebrew Bible, not in the New Testament, but we have evidence for this as well. So these are not just, if you want, as the Quran says, asatirul awwalin, not the stories of old people. And then finally, the person of Abraham, right? The person who was the Abyssinian governor of Yemen, who made an expedition to Mecca, which is mentioned in the Quran as Ashab al-Fil, the people, the companions of the elephant. Not only we have evidence that there was an Abyssinian governor of Yemen called Abraha, which is the exact name in the inscriptions, but we also have evidence that he made an expedition into northern Arabia from Yemen, although it's not quite clear whether he came all the way to Mecca. So this kind of information, which was until now only found in the Quran, had no corroboration in any other text we have some evidence in Arabian inscriptions. And I also worked on the biblical stories of the Quran, and I found that there is actually some internal and external logic, right, to the otherwise haphazard mention of biblical figures here and there in the Quran. And I found out that the Quran, more often than not, has a parallel structure and understanding of biblical history very similar to the Ethiopic and Yemenite versions of biblical books, right? I've mentioned already, I think here, the Book of Jubilees, which is from 2nd century BCE, and it only existed in classical Ethiopic. The mention of Adam, Noah, Abraham, and the patriarchs in the Book of Jubilees and in the Quran are very similar. And another one, the Midrash Hagadol, the great Midrash, coming from Yemen, when it mentions especially the stories of Abraham, which is a very central figure in the Quran, also has a lot of similarities with the Quranic versions of these stories. And again, I already mentioned the Christian stories of the Quran have a lot of similarities with non-canonical Gospels, right? The Gospels that we don't see in the New Testament today. So these are three major areas of research on the Quran, right? I didn't mean it to be exhaustive. This is not all that is, but I can tell you that many of the works that are done by Western scholars on the Quran are on one of these three basic questions: the redaction history of the Quran, the philological and linguistic aspects of the Quran, and finally the content of the Quran, and in particular the biblical content of the Quran. So, in conclusion, at a time when the Quran is getting a lot of scholarly attention, right? Today, not only there's individual interest, there's a lot of institutional interest in the Quran. So today, for the first time, we have an International Quranic Studies Association, a group that is devoted to the study of the Quran, which is a scholarly establishment. There is a project in Germany called Corpus Quranicum, which is a European Union initiative. What they want to do is to record everything in terms of the text of the Quran, the tafsir of the Quran, the variant readings of the Quran. They make a huge catalog, and this is a project funded until 2030, I think. They have a lot of money for this. So there's a lot of individual and institutional interest in the study of the Quran today. So what I wanted to do was to give you a taste of what's going on in the Western tradition of Quranic studies. I also wanted to share this in this, I would say, seminary-like institution where people not only study the Quran critically, but also have a vested interest as believers. And for us, people who are generally in our own environment very critical of the Quran, this is a very interesting experience to at least tell you about what we do and get your comments. Sometimes we really get overly excited and overly skeptical about what we're doing, or forget sometimes what we're doing is some kind of antiquarianism or navel gazing or some very specific work. So I really thank you for this opportunity to present my work, and I'm ready to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dost, for that wonderful presentation. We're going to take question and answer now, but we're going to go one question per person and then as short and succinct as possible so we can get as many people as possible. Okay, so who would like to ask the first question? Okay, we'll start from the front and then we'll work our way back.
All right.
You did mention this discovery in Birmingham University,
Yes.
where they're saying that this could possibly be older than Prophet Muhammad himself.
Yeah, good question. Actually, I would like to bring it, but this is very fresh news if you want. And talking about it, it could be a little too early. But what I can tell you at this moment, and this is something that people have been doing on the Sana'a manuscripts as well, carbon dating helps you if you have a range of, let's say, 200 years, right? If you want to know whether something is from 500 or 700, there it could help you, or even a larger range. But in the Quranic studies, the real battle is being fought in 50, 60, 70 years. And there's no way carbon dating, which has already a range of insecurity of dates, it cannot help you there. So what is being done about the Birmingham copy, people argued that, especially people in Birmingham themselves, argued that this might be even before the Prophet. But the issue is, carbon dating gives you a range. And the copy could be anywhere from the beginning of that range to the end of that range. And if you had any experience with this, you know that the carbon dating uses the ink on the paper, which is coming from a plant, so which is organic, which is some radioactive carbon in it. And it only tells you how old the ink is, right? It doesn't tell you how old the paper is. It doesn't tell you when it exactly was written. It is just basically an estimate. So there has been a lot of talk about this Birmingham copy. We know that it's early. We knew that it's early. That's nothing new because it is part of the codex, I think, in a Hijazi script.
Is it complete copy?
No. One thing is we have no complete copy from this period. No complete copy. But we have so many incomplete copies that match each other. We are sure that from the beginning, Surah Al-Fatiha, all the way Surah Al-Nas, we have a complete copy. But none of them are from the beginning to the end complete. And as I said, this manuscript situation of the Quran is almost, I would say, miraculous in the sense that so many copies we have, a lot of them really early, and people working on anything else, the Odyssey and the Iliad, the Hebrew Bible, the New Testament, would be lucky to have this much material to work with. That's why we have all these excitement about the earliest copies of the Quran. There are so many of them, and they're very early. Yes.
Thank you for a very inspiring and engaging talk on this subject. I really didn't know how the hour went, so
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
your scholarship is really up there. My question is twofold. Firstly, is there a near unanimity about the times of Muhammad, his birth, and his period of his ministry and so forth? Is there any doubt about those dates? That's number one. Number two, it all boils down to the person of the Prophet that Quran is all about. You take away Muhammad, this person, then all of this is secondary. It just pales into.
Yes.
So my question is related to his life and living, and especially the times when he would take caravans from his home base and Khadija's trade that he was engaged in. That is there any kind of detail about his travels and times that he lived in certain areas, such as Damascus? We know that he would frequent, and probably Iraq and Kufa. What was that arc in which he traveled and the times he spent there? Is there any documentation? Because it would be very logical that this would then converge into his persona, and then these commonalities would emerge between what he was exposed to in certain areas, the languages, and the
I see
history and
that.
so forth. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This is a good question, and I guess by profession, an historian. I'm not a religious scholar. I'm not necessarily a person of divinity studies. I'm an historian. This is what brought me to the study of the Quran, because coming from Muslim sources, we have more than enough evidence about the Prophet himself, right? Especially his Medinan life. You can almost write a diary of how he lived. That's how much information we have from Muslim sources. But on the other end of the spectrum, if you're looking for actual material documentary evidence, there is next to nothing, I can tell you. Next to nothing. So that question is what brought me to the study of the Quran, because Quran is the only, I would say, authentic copy about the life of the Prophet. Everything else, like he was born in 571 or 570, that he died in 632, that he made an immigration in 622. All of this information is coming from Muslim sources, right? Which, again, there's no way to prove it wrong. There's no way to prove it right. So that's something we accept, basically. So the answer, I guess, simple answer to your question is, we don't know. The simple answer is we don't know. Muslims, especially, and major Muslim figures become a little apparent in the light of history only beginning with the time of Muawiyah. Because only at the time that Muslims build basic buildings, repaired buildings, and put their names on them. From the time of our Prophet, we don't have any. From the time of the first four caliphs, we don't have any. But Muawiyah, for example, built two dams, both of them very close to Taif. He put inscriptions on them. He called himself Emir al-Mu'mineen. So Muawiyah is probably the first Muslim major figure that kind of is known historically by documentary evidence. All the rest we don't know, right? And by the time the Dome of the Rock, Qubbatul Sakhra, was built in Jerusalem, everything was out there. Christians knew Muslims, Jews knew Muslims. Even today, if you visit the Dome of the Rock, inside there are inscriptions which are taken from the Quran. But before 650, 660, we don't have a lot of evidence, including the Prophet himself. So this is what brought me to the study of the Quran, because we know that the Quran is very early. It mentions the Prophet. It mentions stories from his life and narratives from his life. But other than that, I can, I guess, confidently tell you that we don't have a lot of documentary evidence. Even the fact that the Prophet was born in 571 is based on two different reports. One that he was born in the year of the elephant. The other is an information about the year of the elephant. So that's the only hint that we have about the birth. But these are, again, narrative evidence that we can neither prove nor negate. That's why Quran is very central. It's the earliest document of the Prophet. All the rest, we don't know. Did that answer your question?
Well, yeah, but still, any kind of, detail about where he traveled and.
Oh yeah, we have evidence of this from the Muslim
So,
sources.
From that the findings of this predating him
Mhm.
have to be taken
Yeah.
with a grain of salt.
Definitely,
Then
definitely.
you mentioned that it relates to the age of the ink
Mm-hmm.
rather than the paper,
Yeah,
which is the paper could be like very, very old.
yeah,
Just be
definitely.
laying around, and
Mhm.
then somebody wrote it about the time of the prophet or something. That will fit in. I mean, it doesn't really go counter to.
Definitely,
this.
yeah.
So I think that is the point to kind of marry these two points to go to the authenticity
Yeah, yeah.
of this text, which which is central to our beliefs and which is the real,
Which is the real deal,
nugget,
right?
the central. If you
Yeah.
go away with that authenticity, then everything is up for grabs.
Yeah. Definitely. This is why I'm trying to kind of corroborate the Muslim narrative evidence with actual documentary evidence. And again, it's only normal that actual documentary evidence has gaps in it. Nobody puts stuff out there to make sure that the people in the future will know that certainly this has been the case. But we have small hints, right? We have small hints. So the fact that somebody had a copy of the Quran in Yemen as early as this period is a very good indication that the Quran is a very early text, as early as Muslims believe it is. So these are very good indications for this.
Thank you very much.
Brother Ridwan?
Okay, yeah, we're following the
Yeah.
row, I guess, yeah.
Go on.
I'd like to echo what Dr. Mirza said about your scholarship. Very, very engaging and very informative talk. You mentioned early on how different manuscripts are slightly different than what we have today. One didn't have Surah Al-Fatiha in it, the other one has with the du'as in it. Ordinary Muslims, including myself, believe that the text of the Quran has never been changed, modified. And then towards the very end, you also said that we have these partial copies, but when you put them all together from Surah Fatiha to Surah Nas, it's exactly the same.
Yeah.
So I'm missing something in between.
Yeah.
So
Yes.
elaborate on it, please.
Again, the simple answer to this is there are two versions of the story, right? That's what I mentioned at the beginning. The first version is the Muslim historical version of this. We have no, and I'm underlining this, we have no copy of Ibn Mas'ud intact that we can hold between our hands. None of them exist. I can assure you that all the copies of the Quran today that we have from this early period matches what you have at your home 99.9%, right? These changes that I mentioned at the beginning are mentioned in later Muslim sources. We don't have evidence for them outside of this mention, right? For example, Suyuti, again, like probably the dean of Quranic studies among Muslims, says that there was a copy of Ibn Mas'ud, and Ibn Mas'ud's copy didn't have the Fatiha and Surah Al-Falaq wal Nas. That's all we know. But looking from the documentary evidence perspective, zero evidence for that. We have neither the copy of Ibn Mas'ud nor the copy of Ibn Ka'b. We have mentions of it. What is really, again, outside of my scholarly critical perspective, what makes sure that the Quran is intact in terms of actual manuscripts? We are searching for variants. We are having a lot of hard time finding them. They're exactly the same as they were 13 centuries ago, right? But we have to remember that Muslim scholars themselves mentioned that there were these variants. And Muslim scholars themselves say that there are at least 7 different and acceptable readings of the Quran. These are just what we have in our own tradition. Not even.
What do you mean by readings? Tajweed or?
Let me give you the standard example for this. The standard example for this is if you go to North Africa and you pray behind an imam, which I personally did, they would read Surah Al-Fatiha, Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen, Ar-Rahman Ar-Rahim, Maliki Yawmiddin. They don't say Maliki Yawmiddin. What is the difference?
Alif.
Right, Alif is shorter, right? That's the only difference. Does it make a lot of difference in meaning? Well, one means the king, the other means the owner. It's pretty much the same thing. So these we actually have in our own tradition these differences. A lot of Muslims follow the so-called Hafs reading of the Quran. North Africans follow the Warsh reading of the Quran. And these are among the 7 canonical and acceptable readings of the Quran. This is why I mentioned at some point Ibn Mujahid, who died in, I think, 918, I think, who wrote a book called Kitab al-Sab'a and made these canonical readings fixed. He said, Nobody is going to add anything to this. This is the standard, right? So again, there are two versions of the story: the documentary evidence perspective and the Muslim Quranic studies perspective.
So,
Just follow over.
same points before the
Okay.
But don't we have these 7 ways of reciting the Quran since the time of the Prophet due to the different tongues of the Arab tribes? So I
Yeah.
guess it's not different versions, just one thing but recited different ways.
Yeah, this is again, this is coming from the Muslim sources, and this is the explanation, right? The Prophet said there are 7 huruf of the Quran. There are 7 different ways of reciting the Quran. And Ibn Mujahid, that's what he said. He said, yeah, all these 7 readings are acceptable, they're canonical, because people had different dialects, people had different readings. So this is why, again, looking from the Muslim perspective, this is the story. And there are also interesting stories, especially if you look at Ibn Abi Dawud's Kitab al-Masahif. He tells you, for example, when Uthman ibn Affan first looked at the copy that the companions prepared, and he said, well, this is good, but there are a few, the word he used was ilhan, it's like grammatical, I guess, changes. And he said Arabs will correct it with their tongue. So we have all these stories about how 7 different readings were possible at the early period.
Dr. Oz?
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to question you mentioned the Mesmedi Yemeni script. I believe it's called Mesmedi, if I'm not mistaken. And you sort of represented it as not being Arabic script, or at least not the way we...
The Musnad script?
Yeah, the Musnad script.
Oh, you did the South Arabian, right?
Yeah. And
Yeah.
so the idea there is that it was probably Arabic script for at least for the Southern Arabs, and that's how they articulated their language. And I'll just use an analogy that you can relate to. And, Turkish was written in Arabic or Somali script, and now it's written in Latin script. But that doesn't mean it's not Turkish. It's just that was the script that was used at a certain time.
Yes.
So. I just would like to get some clarification from you. Is
Definitely.
that not Arabic?
Definitely.
It's not the current Arabic script that we have, but it is a script that was used to articulate Arabic and then was replaced by the current thing.
Good question. This is the assumption people have, that this Old South Arabian was the same Arabic language written in a different script. It's a wrong assumption. This is a completely different language. When I say completely different, what I mean is it's unintelligible from one to the other. And one example is they don't use the definite article el. Old South Arabian has a definite article n, which is put at the end of the word. So even this would indicate that this is not the same Arabic we have. On top of that, it doesn't have all the verb forms that we have in Arabic. So beginning with infa'ala, ifta'ala, none of them exist in Old South Arabian. There is no indication of any vowels. So we know for sure that this is a different language. But we also know that it's very close in terms of lexicon, in terms of a lot of the words that are mentioned. But we are 100% sure that this is a different language.
So Yemenis didn't speak Arabic?
Yeah, there's a famous idiom. Back in the day, of course, before the rise of Islam, Yemenis didn't speak Arabic. That we know. And there's an idiom in Arabic, a proverb if you want. Man dakhala dhafari hammara. Do you know what it means? Man dakhala dhafari hammara. They say, the one who enters Dhafar, which is a city in Yemen, they have to speak Himyaritic, or the language of the Himyaris, because even Arabs at the early period knew that Yemenis had a slightly different language. And we know that they were not intelligible from one to the other. Especially after the rise of Islam, Yemenis started speaking Arabic completely. And one interesting thing is this Musnad script died out in around 520, 530, which is the time when Abraha was ruling Yemen. And the reason for this is probably the destruction of the Marid Dam. The irrigation became completely impossible. People moved from south to the north, yes. And this caused the if you want, linguistic shift.
Okay, I actually met a Yemeni archaeologist who said that this Muslim script was that it was still used after the Prophet's time because there's inscriptions in that praise the Prophet.
Yes,
Muhammad.
yes.
So it was used.
Yeah.
in
There were people-
in
yeah.
the first century.
Yeah. There were people who knew it, and they left graffiti with this. But what I mean is, a lot of these inscriptions are left by kings, for example. Because they're not somebody has graffiti; they're standard dedicatory inscriptions made by the kings themselves. What I mean is, the last king who wrote in this inscription is Abraham. Of course, people continued using in their personal life, but that the last person who used it was Abraham, probably in 620s, 630s, when Muslims controlled Yemen. The linguistic environment completely changed, but people still continued using it. And today, one language or dialect, the so-called Sokotri language, is still very close to this, if you say, Old South Arabian language. But we know that, at least from the inscriptions, that these are in a language that is different from Arabic. We also know that Arabic was a very marginal language. It was only used in the western coast of Arabian Peninsula.
Just as a quick follow-up.
Yep.
So how did the Prophet Muhammad, he had quite a few Yemeni companions, and one would assume that he was communicating with them.
Yeah.
And so in what language were they communicating? Many of them came from Yemen if it wasn't Arabic.
We imagine that probably a lot of them were bilinguals, right? Which is completely possible, because also we know that the Prophet incited people to learn Syriac, Hebrew, and the languages of Southern Arabia. So probably a lot of them spoke both of them, because there were trade connections, commercial relations. But even for that, we don't have actual documentary evidence. All we have is mentioning of the stories. And one of them actually mentions when someone from Yemen came and asked the Prophet a question, and during the whole conversation, he used the definite article M instead of N. So these indicate that there were these small differences in the language. And it is also possible, and I'm just saying it as a possibility, that this script that we have was only used for these purposes. Maybe this was not the spoken language, which is possible, right? Because especially in northern Arabia, Arabs wrote in Greek, but spoke Arabic. That we know at least. We have evidence for this. This could be the case in Yemen as well. This is a very interesting topic, because when you don't have anything in Arabic, and again, when you don't rely on Muslim sources, which Western scholars are, very skeptical, this is all you have, because this is there. I mean, it's written, it's out there. You cannot deny it. So this is a really interesting part of Arabian writing culture, if you will.
Yeah, we got time for one more last question, and whatever brother here has been raising his hand from the beginning.
Sure. I mean,
Can't deny him. So
okay, I have
we
time,
only
but
are- yeah, we
it's
got
up to you.
Yeah, like we guys could ask him and talk to him afterwards. That'll be fine. But for
Yeah.
last question, yes.
Yeah. So, two questions. First one,
Sure.
what's the deal with Ezra or Zair? If you can talk about it briefly.
Mhm.
Second, apparently there is kind of epistemological differences between the Islamic culture and the Western culture. Studying the Quran. So basically, the narration is like a core essential thing in the Islamic culture, and this is how the Quran and the Quranic science is being transferred from generation to another. So this kind of westernized Islamic studies based on archaeology and anthropology and the speculation between all of that. So is there any this new Quranic studies? Do they use the Islamic resources or scholars, or they dependently just study look for documentaries and archaeology and anthropology and all that sciences? This is the second question.
Let me begin with the second question. Yes, they use, and I guess I would say we use, because there's no other way of doing this. Muslim scholarship provides you with invaluable material, right? For example, the story about how the first text of the Quran was compiled by Abu Bakr and then copied by Uthman. Nobody knows about that if you don't rely on Muslim sources. Today we call them Uthmanic codices by the very reason that Muslim scholars say that they are Uthmanic codices. So we cannot not do without Muslim sources. That's one thing. And of course, again, since the method is very positivistic in Western scholarship, they also tend to kind of prefer material evidence over narrative evidence. But when there is no material evidence, that's all you have. You have to rely on these. So yeah, and again, as I said, we have no evidence that the Prophet was born in 571, but we have to believe this because there's nothing that counters that argument as well. And the story about Ezra or Zayd, it only mentioned once in the Quran. And it's mentioned in a problematic context where it says the Jews say that Ezra is son of God. How do we match Ezra, the biblical scribe, with Uzair? Muslim scholars did it. Tabari, for example, says that what Jews know as Ezra is Uzair. And again, maybe I forgot to mention it. If you look at Midrash Hagadol, the Yemenite Midrash tradition among the Jews, they have actually an Ezra cult. So it is possible that the Quran is talking about something that the Yemeni Jews believe, which then means that the Quran is not talking about something, completely out of the world. There is a context for this. Not all Jews believe that Ezra is son of God, but among the Yemeni Jews, it seems that there was some Ezra cult, an understanding that Ezra, as the person who saved the Hebrew Bible from dying out, was the person.
Yeah, probably because there's also in the Quran mentioned the Maryam and Jesus as gods, both of them.
Mhm.
So probably also this specificity as there's some cultures Christianity who pray,
Definitely, yeah.
worship Maryam and
Yeah, good mention because some again non-canonical gospels also mention that there was a Mary cult at that time. So these are That's why I mentioned a lot of the times if you're looking at the Quran from the Bible, Hebrew Bible and the New Testament, things might look a little, blurry, but if you actually follow the transmission of the whole tradition through non-canonical texts, you can find interesting evidence, and this is what I've been doing in my research.
We're going to squeeze in one more last question, sorry. The gentleman here.
Sure, please, yeah, you've been raising your hand for a long
You
time.
mentioned right off, it's Muslim sources, I assume you mean the collection of hadith and all that stuff.
Yes.
So Western scholars, you kind of mentioned before, but so what exactly do they do with this material? Among themselves, do they have any way of evaluating and trying to determine what's the probability that some of it's right or not right, by maybe looking at consistency of stories or
Yeah,
whatever?
good question, and I'll try to give a quick answer. 1970s was the time, they first problematized the reliability of these sources. Since then, actually people with a little more serious scholarship, I would say, focus on the people mentioned in the traditions, for example, the content of the traditions, the places that are mentioned, the so-called isnad chain, the people who gave the information. They try to match their biographies with the actual report that is mentioned and try to see maybe there is a layer that is authentic, instead of saying that, all these came from the 9th century, all of them are unreliable. So recently, yes, there is a tendency to do the literary critical methods, to apply these methods to figure out whether there is some layer of authenticity to these sources. But people are still very skeptical. And in some measure, they are right in being skeptical because they are late. I mean, for a Muslim, this might not pose any problem because our problem is not authenticity most of the time. But as you know, Al-Bukhari died in 870, right? Was born in 810, I think, which is, 150 years after the death of the Prophet. So a Western scholar, they're right in their skepticism about this. But instead of saying all these are completely garbage, we cannot rely on them, the better would be use some of these critical methods and try to see if there's any layer of authenticity. And that's why recently there's this tendency to work on these as material that is possibly having some measure of reliability, if not complete.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dost. For
Thank
As a token of our appreciation, we give our guest speakers a gift. So Dr. Ali would like to present to you.
Thanks so much for thought-provoking and inspirational talk.
Thank you.
Let's
I guess they're taking pictures, right?
yeah, let's take pictures. Okay. Thank you for coming.